Hello and welcome to this webinar, Trends Within Finish the Attack, Implications for Practice. My name is Simon Houston. I'm a Games Insight Analyst at the FA. I'm delighted to be joined by Kelsey Byrne, one of our women's national coach developers for the Northwest and Midlands. First of all, Kelsey, how are you?
Good, thank you, Simon. Thanks very much for inviting me on to talk about this today. Thanks very much.
No problems. Hopefully it's a good one. So let's just dive straight into the key outcomes then of the webinar. So we've got two clear outcomes really. I mean, there'll be a lot around it, but we just wanted to group it into two key outcomes. So we've got the WSL goal data from last season that yourself, Kelsey, and I've looked at collecting some of the data. So we've been through an extensive data collection process to turn hopefully some of this data into information that will be presented on the webinar to provide some objective insight, like it says there, for shining a light on finishing the attack phase. And then following on from that, it's about turning that information that we've got into some insight. So it's provoking thought. It's putting it right back to yourselves as viewers of this webinar and provoking some thought into how it can be transferred onto the training pitch. And again, just like I say, following on from that, it's your own environment. All the time we're thinking about how we can serve this up for our own players, working with our own staff in our own environments, whatever they might be. So just as a little introduction to some context behind the data, if we're looking at finishing the attack phase, Kelsey, do you want to just talk us through this slide?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this slide for me is a really good kickstart to this topic in particular. And I think how often do we consider this of how possession actually starts in the attacking third, to start to think about how might my practices start realistically for players. And obviously this data is from the WSL in particular. And we have also got some data from the 17s and 20s World Cup in regards to the women's game. And it wasn't much different. You've got 53% possession from transition, and then you've got 30% from throw-ins. So actually it goes higher in throw-ins, especially for the 17s, 20s, that youth sort of age. So it's starting to think about what does that now mean for my practices. And obviously that's attacking third. If we look even further into halves, because if you think about most coaches on the call might work in halves, especially working in phases of play and things like that in regards to looking at finishing the attack. So attacking halves, you've got 63% from transition and 61% from 17s to 20s World Cup. So it's a real big stat really in regards to how can we make sense of that and utilize it as much as possible in our finishing practices, and even if you just look at then how that might be implemented / influenced on games and game day, especially by the opposition, it's starting to think about how much is led by you and your style based on the transition. So is it a high press? Is it the way you like to win the ball back? Is that the way you usually would play? Or how much of that is influenced by the opposition itself and the way that they play, or the way that they build the attack. And then the level of competition, the context, all that will then play a part in how much we actually do then gain back from transition or from throw-ins or from free kicks or from corners. So I know we've done quite a lot of stuff in the past through different WSL teams. And if you just look at someone like Reading, for example, fantastic at the way that they press, and they love to press and high press, but they really want to get some set pieces, the free kicks and corners. So how often do we plan for that based on the opposition that we play or might face from both aspects, out of possession and in possession? And how does that affect what we do in the build-up versus then your sort of development around, if I'm starting to develop players, what do I need to expose them to on a weekly basis to expose them to as much as possible and serve them up as much as possible to prepare them for the game? So I think this is a really interesting slide just to unpick as a starter, and I think we could probably spend the whole webinar just on this slide itself, but it's a great one to consider, to then start to think about then the implications as we get closer to the 18-yard box.
Great. So that frames us up then really to keep in our minds for the remainder of the webinar. So here we've got just some thoughts on how we might measure a goal. In the early stages of our data collection for the WSL, we had lots and lots of conversations about where we were going to take it, what we were going to measure. I think that's the key thing. You know, this webinar is about trends within Finish the Attack, and I guess the key message is understanding what you're looking for before you go after it. With any data collection process, you know, taking it into a youth development phase coach, if they want to look at a certain aspect of playing in finishing the attack, it's about knowing what you're going after and kind of starting with the end in mind. So here's a menu really of some of the stuff that we looked at, some of the stuff that we considered when collecting the data. So you can see, first of all, is what you're going after tactical? Are you trying to uncover something technical, or is it around game context? It could be all three of those things, and it could be all of these things that are on the screen. But I guess, like I say, it's starting with the end in mind and knowing that if there's an answer you want to a question that you've got, a performance-related question, it's knowing how to answer it and what you're going to go after beforehand. So again, this is just some context behind what we collected, and we're going to unpick some of these things, not everything, but some of these things in the webinar today. Kelsey, you've got experience obviously in collecting all of these in the data collection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's just really important to think about, drawing on your point, Si, around, you know, what is it you're going after and how do they all impact and influence each other? You know, what are the key things that could potentially impact that real technical finish and what it is that we're trying to do as an end product. So we found, especially just giving some examples, especially from the WSL data, if you scored the first goal, you were 73% more likely to win the game. So how does that then impact, well, am I doing enough in the first bits of my finishing practice to really emphasize that first goal? Or do we give them so much repetition that they get 15, 20, 30 strikes at goal that actually there's no real value on that first goal because we do lots and lots and lots and lots? So how much do we then utilize what we're finding to then start to impact what we do? There was another piece around average time down to 10 men, which was 33 minutes. So 33 minutes, the impact of a red card. How does that impact then the state of the game? Plus then impact if you win or lose a game or maintain a lead, or do you come back, or is it a draw, etc. Like, where do we normally come out if we do go behind? Have we ever been behind before? You know, with my players and the way that we play, or at the competitions we play in, and if we haven't, then how do we serve that up for players to give them an experience and to almost supply that to them, especially in developmental football, or if we're preparing for competition, that if that does happen, we're prepared for 33 minutes and not necessarily 3 or 4 minutes that we might practice. So I think there's lots of things that come out of this that can really help us consider how we might do some finishing practices and do the finishing the attack, but with some real context and information and some real purpose behind it.
Brilliant. That takes us on to these WSL headlines. So getting into some of the data now that we collected recently from last season's WSL. It's very much surface level data, but it gives us a clear direction. This is something that we wanted to have an idea of before we started interrogating further in certain areas. So some context there, just on the left-hand side. 259 goals were scored last season, and if we just flick it on there, 72% was open play goals, and that's the part really that this webinar will be unpacking. We've just filtered out set play goals for reasons that give us different contexts, different types of finishes. So we've just gone with the open play goals. So there's 187 of those that we're going to be. The data will show us some insights from. Again, we've got left foot, right foot headers, just some context for, hopefully, for practice design. Inside, outside the box. And also the goals per season, how they've changed from the previous season to this study. To this study to this season. And that's just the first 7 game weeks. So it's increased. It's a high scoring league, Kelsey.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think that's probably the real important bit when we're thinking about data. Really, is around how rapidly the trends do change and how things do move on. And I think that's really important to emphasise when collecting data and interpreting data. It's about how does it inform what you do, but how do you constantly checking and challenging against that as well, not just always taking it for granted that that what it's telling you in terms of numbers is correct. It's really interrogating behind that. So it's starting to think about what, especially for the coaches listening, what does this look like for you and your players, and how has this move changed based on the competition level that you're now playing at, the level of experience of the players that you now have, etc. And do we know this? I think is a key message. Is like, how much do we know about the demands of the game that our players play and the demands of the competition our players play in week in, week out, in order to support them to meet those demands on a week-to-week basis.
Definitely. So let's dive a little bit further in to the webinar. Now we've seen the WSL headlines. So Kelsey, you wanted to talk about styles and strategies and how this impacts the data in a little bit more team context, because up until now we've just shown you the league stats. So I guess it's very valuable to think now in terms of team by team and how styles and strategies can affect that.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we think about finishing the attack, we start to think about 18 on top of 18 yard box practices, lots of finishing, high repetition. And how often do we really think about that predetermined plan around how we're going to get there? So we understand, especially from the data, which we'll go into, some real key areas of focus where we need our key players to land and be in order to have the most efficient way of trying to score goals. But when you start thinking about how do we even get there in the first place, what does that look like based on our own style and strategy and how we want to try and implement things at our club. And I think just looking at the data, really, as we know, data can be quite led by key teams. It happens in the Premier League, Liverpool and Man City, and it happens here in the WSL with Chelsea, Arsenal and Man City. If you look at all the goals that they've scored last season, they probably make up a lot of the 259 goals that we've looked into and collected. So I think it's just really important that we actually look at those teams in particular and look at how effective or efficient their possession is. Like, how do they look to use the ball in these areas in particular? What are the trends? What do they try and do? The characteristics based on the players that they have. And I think sometimes we can get lost in what possession means in twofold, really. I think when we do the build in the attack, it's possession. And when we get into the final third, it's how quickly can we attack goal as quick as possible. And those change quite quickly. So it's starting to think about, what's the balance between that and what do different teams do in each of those, and which teams are using the possession-based football, which teams are not. So if we take Arsenal as an example, they seem to have the most key actions prior to a finish. Every time we collected data, they seem to be the team that had up to 11, 12 key actions prior to that final finish and that final strike. And I suppose what we mean by key actions is some key things that lead up to the goal, whether that's a pass, a turnover in transition, whatever that might be. So Arsenal were the ones that seemed to keep the ball for longer periods of time prior to getting a finish. Now, against Bristol in particular, they had 11 key actions. A number of reasons. Could that be based on what Bristol were presenting them in terms of, did they get into a block, make it difficult for Arsenal to play? Arsenal had to use the ball more efficiently and effectively to try and open up specific shots that they wanted to take. But then if you compare that to Chelsea, as we know, are a little bit more direct in their play. Direct, not as in long ball, direct as in purposeful. They move the ball quickly, forward early, into some real specific patterns and pitches that they want to try and get out based on the players they have. So Chelsea were out of the top three, out of Arsenal, Man City and Chelsea. Chelsea were the ones that had the least key actions in most of their goals. And again, that's led by the style, the strategies, the way they like to do things. But even if we compare Chelsea to Arsenal against Bristol will probably, sat in the block, made it really difficult for both of them teams, top two teams. Bristol were fighting to stay in the league at the time. make it really difficult for both teams to play. Arsenal continue to use their strategy of manipulating the ball and trying to find ways to penetrate and get shots on goal, whereas Chelsea scored. They scored 6 past Bristol, and the most key actions they used were 3 at any one time.
In a single goal.
So what is it that Chelsea managed to do that Arsenal didn't in terms of that real short key actions? But what did Bristol give Chelsea to allow them to continue to implement their style and strategy? Or what did Chelsea do to manipulate Bristol so they could? That they could continue with that real short, sharp turnover, short key actions in order to get shots off a goal early. So I thought that was really interesting, just to compare and contrast the two. And then even just looking at what system they played. So if you look at Chelsea and Arsenal, Chelsea at times had played a 4-4-2. Did that allow them to be more direct at times and allow them to go forward earlier? And Arsenal actually scored a goal against Chelsea. When I looked at this and broke it down and started to think about what happens if they played each other. And Arsenal played against Chelsea and utilised 9 key actions prior to the goal against Chelsea. So it seemed to be even consistent against top team versus top team. So it seems to be a real style that they're implementing, a real way in which they had a predetermined plan of getting into that final third, where they wanted to get to, how they wanted to utilise the strengths of the players that they have in their team. And it seemed to be quite consistent throughout. So I thought that was a really interesting study to look into the teams and how they utilise some of this, because I think when we start looking at key actions and what happens prior, I think we need to really start to be considerate around, one, how we want to do things, but also how the opposition might present different problems and how we might overcome those on a week-to-week basis.
Great. I think you've painted some really vivid pictures there about the key actions and styles and strategies of some teams. I guess it's the styles and strategies dictating what the data does, rather than the data dictating what you then do with your style and strategy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or is it a two-way thing?
I think obviously you've got to take into consideration data and what it's telling you, because it's very subjective. It's telling you sort of what it is in front of you around what are the demands of the game, and I think we can't hide away from that, and I think we need to utilise that a lot more than what we do. But I think, again, going back to a key message that have gone throughout a number of workshops that we've implemented data, is that it's really important to know what the data is, but not let it lead you and just inform you and inform what you do next. Allowing it to lead you can be dangerous, especially without having a clear picture of what sits behind numbers. What does the picture look like behind that? And the landscape's ever changing.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be really conscious of that and prepare players for the changing landscape, and just utilise the data to support trying to work out, is what we're doing effective and efficient and having the impact that we want it to have, and reviewing that on a daily basis or weekly basis.
Yeah. The point you made about having a good idea of how the data was collected is brought us on nicely to our next point. So we've got this idea of key actions prior to the finish, and this is something we looked at in quite a lot of depth. So we're going to just introduce a video now to show one of Arsenal's goals, and it'll bring it to life, some of the points you just made about Arsenal. Mm-hmm. A little case study of Arsenal coming up, Arsenal and Chelsea. So first and foremost, this just brings the data collection to life of things that we spotted in the build-up to each goal. And how we categorize them. We start to then collect them into different categories and then see which ones popped up the most. So with Arsenal, passes through or through balls was quite a prominent thing. There we've got a setback. And we've got a pass beyond that back line. So a varying different key actions across there. then we've got another cross. So that would count as 2 crosses, but we've collected the data just to show that this goal does feature a cross at some stage. Then got a clearance from the defender, all prior to the finish. So these are all things now that we can use this lens however you want to categorize it. You use your own data, your own categories, and your own environments. But having that lens on how does the finish come about and what makes up this goal, and is this something which is repeatable, predictable, things that we've worked on in training. You'll note there that Arsenal attacked down the right-hand side, and that's something that we'll look at further in the webinar. So yeah, just our definition of a key action was just a single action within that sequence before a goal, which has a significant impact on the next outcome. Like Kelsey said, we collected a maximum of 11, because when you start getting into lots and lots of numbers, then it starts to become a little bit more insignificant. But we've seen that goal there. We've seen Arsenal's goal, and hopefully it's brought to life what a key action is before we start to unpick them in further detail.
Mm-hmm. I think just adding on to that side as well, I think that even just watching that Arsenal video, it's clear then that the style coming out and how that style can then dictate at some points what those key actions might be and how consistent those key actions might be in a build-up. So how often do they feature? Do we know that they feature that often? Sometimes we're just really blind to what types of key actions feature consistently into build-ups because we're so excited about the balls getting closer to the goal as coaches and managers. We're just watching and we see the strike and then we forget everything that's happened prior because it's either gone in or we've missed and our arms are in the air. So it's starting to think about, do we know what them consistent key actions are? And are they emphasised through work we do on the training pitch? And again, it comes back to that battle of how much do we then utilise those consistently in our build-up and within training, and how much do we actually implement other ones and add further strings to our bow around what others can we implement if and when the opposition stop us from doing that. So I think that it's interesting just to see that live and play out.
Definitely. So we'll go into the key actions now. So what you can see here, regains, crosses, individual runs, and passes through, aka through balls. This we found were the top 4 most common to feature in the WSL goals in open play. So you can see there, 42% of all open play goals feature a regain at some stage. It takes us back to that slide we showed about transition at the start and where possessions originate from in the final third. So it aligns with that. Again, crosses feature very prominently. Individual runs or a dribble or run in with the ball to beat a player, and that pass through. So we've seen some of them in the video beforehand. Is that something you'd guess at, or what are the first things that are coming out for you there, Kelsey?
I think just probably looking at it as someone that's been in a female game a long time, just dispelling that myth of crosses that don't feature heavily in the women's game. We don't cross lots in the female game. It's not a thing. And actually, this is showing us that they do feature. And I suppose what the question is to you guys, like what would you deem as a cross? What is a cross?
Yeah.
And then even for the coaches, what would they deem as a cross if they were doing this for their team?
I think that's important, and we will unpack the crosses as well in this webinar. For me, it's excuse me. For me, it's are these common features in goals, and that's why the data is so high, or are they common features in attacking sequences in the final third? So not to say if we make a regain, it's going to turn into a goal, but these are common things that hopefully our practice design should bring out. For example, we just saw the Jordan Nobbs goal there. It featured 2 crosses. Mm-hmm. So there was almost a second phase, and we'll bring that into in a second. But that had 2 crosses in, so the data would show that up. It also had a clearance as well. So these are things that the data is bringing out, and hopefully practice design can begin to replicate those demands on the pitch. We've now got those secondary ones, another list of what we collected, and bringing on that second phase as well. The idea, Kelsey, of some of these stats can be grouped into a second phase, and then it starts to become quite prominent within certainly the WSL goals.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's how often do we set up our practices to allow second phase? Is it step back, finish? Is it once we turn over possession, then that's finished? Is it we do a cross and finish in? But how often do we try and get that second phase in, or supply a second phase ball for one, an out of possession focus and allowing centre halves and the back lines to deal with those second phases, but also a reactionary piece from the front line around where do we need to position ourselves for that second attack? How do we sustain the attack? Where do we position ourselves? One, for the first ball coming in, but secondary to ensure that we can sustain that. And if it does happen again, we're in a really good position to utilise the regain that'll happen again and that transition. How do we stay on top so that if we've delivered the first ball, how do we get the second as well? So I think, just taking into consideration all that and linking that in again, Si, with that first slide of the transition, I think that's really important when considering finishing practices.
Definitely. So let's zoom in now to one of our most dominant key actions that we've just seen on that last slide, crossing. So the first thing we want to draw your attention to is the fact that crosses featured in 41% of all open play goals. We've just seen that on the last slide. So they featured at some point within the sequence prior to a goal. But again, you're adding further evidence now of how important crosses are in the WSL. So they actually assisted. So that means it was the last key action before the finish. 35%, over a third of all open play goals. Mm-hmm. So again, it's dispelling that myth, Kelsey. But I would say in a lot of the data we see across different leagues, male and female, that it is and certainly the men's game always has been a huge part of the game.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's really important here, Si, is that it's not the league or the context of male or female, it's the stat and the data and trying to interpret what that means for me. And again, if this is your players, what would that stat look like in particular for your team? The way that, if we go back to the previous conversation on styles and strategies that you will use, how likely is a cross to feature in your key actions as a team? Does it feature heavily? Is it one-offs? What do them crosses then actually look like? And we're going to get into some detail around that. But I think it's just trying to interpret the numbers and the data itself and what that means for you rather than the context of the league or what teams are utilising that.
Yeah, so hopefully while you're viewing this webinar, you've got some ideas of what a cross looks like for you, what you might see in the Premier League week in, week out, what your training looks like with your own players. But essentially the definition that we had, and it's broad, it's purposely broad. It's essentially when the ball is played from a wide position with the intended outcome of creating an immediate goal scoring opportunity into a more central area. So it could be quite ambiguous, but we're going to break it down with different types of things that we've seen and collected. So this is all of the crossed assists, the 35% of goals, and the location that the cross actually occurred. So essentially, where do the successful crosses occur? What are your first thoughts looking at that, Kelsey?
I think just initially looking at lanes, in particular 1 and 5, you can see that it's not the traditional cross as we would expect, especially when you look at the top of the Premier League. You're looking at Trent Alexander-Arnold, and he'll cross it from lanes 3, 4, or 5. He can come up from the inside, and he's whipping one. De Bruyne has obviously now started to do that from inside channels. So it's starting to feature heavily that crosses are coming closer and closer and closer to the 18. And then you can start to argue, are they crosses, are they passes? What determines each one? And I think that's obviously for individual teams and coaches and managers to think about and interpret when they're doing their data collection around what would they deem as a cross. But I think, lanes 1 and 5 there seem to be a lot less dense than as you start to get closer and closer to lanes 2 and 4 really. And I think, has the physical aspect of the female got a little bit to do with that in regards to lanes 1 and 5? Is it just the styles and strategies that teams are implementing that they like to come further inside? There was a huge trend around it, inverted wingers, that wingers would come inside rather than the traditional outside. So as that over time and the trends potentially impacted that. And I suppose now it's starting to unpick the types of players that would get into those areas. And you can see there that the number 5, just even looking at that now, the number 5 on both sides, left and right, is literally in identical places, just opposites and mirroring. So there's something around that lane in particular and that area in particular that is quite effective, I suppose, in opening up goal scoring opportunities and chances. And it is starting to think about where would the back line be in relation to that. Would that be a pass beyond the back line, behind the back line, in line with the back line, in front of for a strike? What would that look like? And overlapping that then with finishes and what types of finishes would we expect from that area? And I think delving into that a little bit further into them numbers, I think would really help, especially coaches and managers start to unpick what does this mean for them?
Yeah. So when we look at data like this, we always want to turn it into some kind of meaningful information. So we've just come up with 3 categories there. So layered on top of those locations, you can see that those deeper crosses that I don't know, maybe deemed more traditional areas, that deep cross from a wider position outside the box, maybe deemed more traditional, but still quite a high percentage, certainly in the WSL. And again, like you say, styles and strategies. What does it look like for your team, and how do you get into those positions?
I think adding on to that as well, the second phase, where would second phase crosses come from? And as we've seen on that Arsenal video, it was probably from lane 2 or just the real outside of lane 1, where in that second phase where it's gone back over to the back post. So that's probably coming in, if we looked in that inside 38% there on that left-hand side, the second cross is coming from there. So is it the primary cross or is it the secondary cross? And how much will that then affect the data, the numbers, but also then where you position players to sustain that attack?
Yeah, sure. So we've looked at where the crosses are coming from. Now let's look at where they've been delivered to. So we've got now our category of that most common cross that we found. We found by our definitions that a cross which was passed across was evident 32% of the time for our crosses. They were delivered into this area. And we've then got the next 4 types of crosses that we looked at, which weren't as prominent, but you can see the definition of a stood-up cross occurred 26% of the time, whipped, driven, and cutbacks as well. I guess the thing here, Kelsey, is that they do look different, and at times you can see trends that they're occurring or being delivered in different areas, down to a number of things: technique, where defenders could be, and like you say, your team style and strategy.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important to consider, would be what type of cross would I need based on what the opposition are presenting in terms of their back line, how deep it is, how high it is, where they're positioned, the type of pressure they've got on the cross, etc. What would that then look like? Do we have a variety of those, or is it quite similar based on our style and the way we do things? Well, then what would that then demand of the player that then is going to do the final action of the finish? What technical requirements are needed? What's the timing that's needed? Is it likely that you'll get a second phase from it or not? What would that look like if it did? And how might I recreate some of this in training to really get that to look similar to the demands that we're going to face? And I think what's really important in terms of the technical is we start to think about, we're gonna look at this in some more detail as we go through, but what type of finish would be from those types of crosses, the timing, the anticipation, the noticing of defenders, the noticing of goalkeepers, where the goalkeeper likely to be off that type of cross, and really starting to think about the detail of what I can give strikers or players that are sort of executing that final action and that final strike, as well as weighing up then their own strengths and weaknesses. So, what is the strengths of the players that are getting on the end of it, and are we marrying up the two? So is the pass across going to be the one that's going to be more effective and efficient for the strikers and the forward players that we have in our team, or would it look different? And I think that's what's important then, to start marrying up the players, types of players you have, with the styles, and then also what the opposition is allowing or presenting you at that moment in time.
Yeah. I think with using this in your own environment, if you were to perform an exercise like this within a club, with a specific team, you might find, for example, that a stood-up cross is the most common type because of the personnel that you've got in the box, because of your forward players and the services that they like. But again, it just gives you clear focus to revert back to the video, for example, to observe training with a different lens, or observe a match performance with a different lens. So again, this isn't the end of the process for delivering insight. This is part of the process, but not the end goal. We wouldn't necessarily make any decisions based on these graphics, but it then excuse me, it then gives us direction for a further interrogation.
Yeah. Adding on to that side, just starting to add and piece all the data together. So if you look at where crosses are coming from and the locations, and then being lanes 2 and 4, or the real insides of 1 and 5, is that how likely are you to get a stood-up cross from that area? What likely to look like? Therefore, is the pass across the most, the most used because of the types of areas that the crosses are coming from? And are we starting to think about these different types of crosses from different areas and supplying players with those differences on a regular basis, and starting to think about when would be the most efficient and effective time to use each of these crosses? What areas do we want the ball to be placed into?
Yeah.
And then what's the technical requirements of the players on the end? So I think adding them all together, really.
You've rightly alluded to what areas do we want the ball to be placed into. Again, bringing that key action element into it as well. So what's happening before the cross? You talk about relationships between players. It's about a wide player here selecting the best type of cross for the picture that they've got in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think if it was, for example, a midfielder playing the ball out to a wide player, they've then got to have some information on that pass to determine, to allow the wide player to play the best picture they see. For example, if they've got a 1v1 with a fullback, a pass across sometimes is difficult. So it's more of a whipped cross. It's out of your feet. It might be stood up to the back post because of the number of players you've got in the box, or someone at the front post area. So it's allowing the pass beforehand. It allows also determines the type of cross as well. Mm-hmm. So all of these things are interconnected. Yeah,
and the types of players that are actually crossing them in. So is it that my centre midfielders rotated out and ended up in that wider area? Is it your De Bruyne type of cross from there? Is it your fullback that's crossing? Is it the wide player? Is it the striker that's gone into the channel and then playing one across? Who is it that's ended up out there? Is it a second phase from a corner? We've just seen from the first picture there that corners is come into play in regards to that. So is it a second phase and my centre halves are up there? Who is it that's in and around that phase at that moment in time? To start to think about which one of these might it be, what areas do we want to hit, etc.
Great. So we'll continue to focus on key actions, but we'll now turn our attention more towards how this insight can be useful for developing individuals. So to develop a player, you ultimately have to become an expert in what they're good at and where they need to develop. So we need to look at, first of all, we need to look at common behaviours and habits. So Kelsey, what are your thoughts on this?
I think obviously looking at the data as it is, you can see that there were two prolific goal scorers in the league last year. And just looking at that, both still quite young players, still sort of establishing themselves. And you can see sort of Miedemar has obviously come to life last year and this year in particular. And it's just looking at then starting to think about where the percentages lie. Is there some ones that are quite heavy and dominant compared to others in regards to those key actions that come prior? And it might start to tell us a little bit about the type of player that they are. Definitely links back into that style and strategy around how the team would like to get the ball up to these dominant players and the players that are the most prolific in front of goal. But then also like which ones are most effective for that player and why. And again, that battle of, do we continuously use those because that's what they're good at? Or what are the areas in which we don't seem to be getting as much joy from, and how do we start to implement some development around there? So just as an example of that, sort of, there was a great interview with Siobhan Chamberlain, who was literally speaking about Miedemar recently, especially after the game at Man City, and she's just took over the all-time WSL top goal scorer off Nikita Paris. She's got 75 in total now. And we were looking at her open goals, obviously, from last year. But it's starting to think about, she had no goals from outside the box last year. Whether that's the style and strategy of Arsenal, the way they like to do things, the way that those key actions lead prior, but she had nothing from outside the box. Everything was inside the box, whereas Arsenal themselves only had one goal from outside the box in the whole season. So it's starting to think about, what types of options are presented to her to finish based on that style, but also the opposition and what they're trying to do to stop her from scoring, because that's becoming more evident. And recently, teams are going to start to think about what types of things she does. And therefore, now is she needs more strings to her bow. So just recently in the last game, scored a goal from outside the box against Man City from transition, turnover of play, gets the ball, finishes early, because she knows if she continues with a dribble or she gets further touches, as we know from the data, more touches equals more bodies in the way, more bodies in the way equals less goals. So she's starting to adapt her game now, and whether that's Arsenal and the coaches there helping and supporting her do that, to add more strings to a bow that stop the opposition from reducing her shots on goal or her chances that she's got. So I think it's just really interesting looking at the variation of percentages across all of those, really, especially Miedemar as compared to Bess.
Yeah, obviously two very successful players in their own right, but very different as well. So let's unpack this first of all. So it's one of Miedemar's top key actions that are featured in her goals, the crosses, and from the 7 goals from open play that she scored, from the 15, 7 of them have been assisted by crosses. Again, we've just got that little heat map there, if you like, to show the locations. Really interesting. Obviously, the main thing really is they're all down the right-hand side and all in that deeper cutback past across position that we saw. So I know from collecting the data myself, I watched every single goal in order of the WSL. I didn't pick up on this, rightly or wrongly. I didn't pick up on this as it wasn't something I was looking for. So the data really has kind of unearthed this quite nicely. But again, we showed you the Jordan Nobbs goal as well beforehand, and that was from an initial cross and build a play down the right-hand side. So it's something that Arsenal are definitely looking to do. And the shot locations for those 7 cross assists collected in a similar area as well within the 6-yard box, and it would suggest that it's almost a back post finish across the ball's going across the goal, and she's finishing that in that back post area. I think as coaches we're asked to collect or store quite a lot of data in our heads, quite a lot of information. So it's just a case of would you be aware as a coach of something like this? It could be quite obvious, but there are other things at play with every single player on the pitch, certainly in the finish the attack phase, Kelsey.
Yeah, and I think what's a good thing to unpick on in terms of this would be like what's allowing this type of action to occur. So what's allowing us to get into those, definitely that 3 and the 2 on the cross assist. But then what types of balls are being delivered, when, the timing, what's happening to the pressure on the ball, when does it get delivered, in order for allow that ball to travel all the way across that back line and end up at the back post. What's Miedemar's movement as all this is occurring and happening to allow her to arrive as the ball arrives in that opportunity at the back post. And she's got, obviously, if you add the 3 and the 2 there together, you've got the 5 that's kind of heavily sitting towards that back post area, that's suggesting the ball's coming across the back line and she's starting to finish. So what types of finish would that be? Would it be first time finishes? What's the timing and arrival of that? Are we doing enough work with our players on what that looks like? The stride pattern in order to arrive as the ball arrives, and my stride to be equally matched, that when I do get there I can then open up to then strike the ball or place the ball as I arrive in the back of the goal. Am I assessing the goalkeeper as the ball's travelling? What am I scanning and looking for in order to be successful when the ball arrives there? So there's a number of different things to consider just by looking at that data alone, I think.
Yeah, sure. And that'll take us into this video. So we're going to bring that information to life, and hopefully the real insight comes where the data's given us the information, and the insight then comes from re-observing certain aspects of performance. So we can see Arsenal breaking lines with the pass through, which featured, we saw in Miedemar's goals quite heavily.
Mm-hmm.
Just out of shot now, just on the left-hand side of the screen. We've got another pass through, but these are all triggers, Kelsey, for Miedemar before the ball's even crossed the halfway line.
Yeah.
For what type of finish she might be expecting in 5, 6, 7 seconds time.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, a body shape here. So as the ball's travelled across with that through ball from sort of one side of the pitch to the other centre midfielder who's now on the ball, that her body position has just opened up and changed. She's changed the hips to shoulders so she can see the ball, but she actually hasn't travelled towards the ball, got drawn in. She's just watching the build-up at the moment. So you can see there the 4 players from the opposition, the back 4 there, really narrow, compact, getting drawn towards the ball quite quickly to go and get that pressure on. And she's just hovering there at that back post, ready to then exploit the area that she knows she's good at. So that game craft of her really analysing her own strengths and weaknesses, what types of finishes she likes, what she's successful at. She knows that as that ball's going to come across, she knows now where she needs to be and where she's heading. Again, looking at her stride pattern and making sure that she's staying in line with the ball. She knows where it's coming. She keeps scanning on the ball to see where the ball is. And it's interesting then to see when she scans the keeper, see where she is. And it's interesting the type of finish that she selects. Because again, it's a right foot. She's heavily dominant on that right foot. So if the positioning of that defender was different, would she have to allow the ball to come across her body and finish on the left foot? So is that now telling me, okay, we're really successful at these crosses from these areas, we're really successful at the back post, but actually to be more successful, could we work on Miedemar then allowing that ball to come across and using the left foot in that type of example? And is that where we then as coaches and managers support that?
Definitely. So again, we could have picked a number of goals here, but this, without any of the animations on, may just look like a normal goal. But once we've unpacked the data and come back to watching this goal, it becomes clear that this is an obvious pattern. Arsenal like to keep the ball in that final third, recycle it around, to then break lines with through balls and through passes. And again, she's just lingering in that back post area, just between the fullback and the centre half there. But she would already be sensing what type of chance she's going to be getting and the type of finish and movement that she'll be needing. So this is where key actions can actually become a good indicator of performance, but also a good indicator of how goals are scored. That's something we've found to be really important.
Mm-hmm. And definite triggers for players to start to recognise the patterns of the game, especially patterns within our own team. Start to think about when the ball's in these areas, what's likely to come next. because the game is so complex and there's loads of decisions to be made in the moment. What is it that's pre-planned and predetermined that we can work from? Some real anchors that we can refer back to and know that if the ball's here, this is likely to happen. And if it doesn't happen, what's likely to come next? And I think it's clearly obvious looking at them Arsenal ones that they've got a real predetermined plan and some real key anchors of what they refer back to on a regular basis.
Yeah, sure. So you've alluded to Chelsea's team style already, Kelsey. So we've got heavily dominated Beth England's 12 open play goals, heavily dominated by passes through, like we've just seen with Arsenal. But there doesn't seem to be anything close to that within the data. So we've got passes through, but we'll just take a look at this graphic as well. And this is where the 10 of the goals that have featured an assist, there's 10 of them. These are the areas they've come from. So there's a left-hand side dominance there. A couple from her own half have been assisted from her own half. But that's quite an interesting graphic, Kelsey.
I think if you look at Arsenal's and where they were positioned, and then you look at the key actions and the amount of key actions prior, they take a lot of time to work the ball into those areas, and do so with certain patterns. And they know the implications of if they do that and they keep possession for long enough, what types of key actions they might need then to break the opposition down and the areas they want to get into to deliver them final balls. Whereas you can see here, Chelsea are quite reactive to playing that ball forward, direct, purposeful, early, at the earliest opportunity. So whether that's in our own half, left, right, deep, on the byline, wherever that might be, wherever there's an opportunity, we're going to get the quickest route in and try and get those again. But although it is a through pass, start to think about where are them through passes coming from, and what type of through pass, the weight, etc., based on all these different distributions of these 10 different locations. And I think even just looking at Beth's goals, out of Miedemar's goals, she was really heavily, predominantly first time. Heavily, I think 12 out of the 15 were all first touch. Whereas with Beth's, it's a real mixture of 2, 3, or 3 plus touches, which is telling me that she's getting on through balls, but then because of the directness, there's still space to travel into. There's still work to do. So those types of finishes will look really different to Miedemar's first time finishes. So how often are we serving up, if we're in developmental football, different ways of doing that and different circumstances that will offer different psych returns, different technical, tactical returns, different decisions. But then as a team, do we know what types of finishes that our strikers or our attacking players will be most likely to score based on the way that we do things and our style and our strategies that we implement? So I think that's really interesting, that the comparison and the contrast between the two teams, but also then the two individuals that heavily then make up those teams.
Definitely. So if we just observe the 2 assists either side of the centre circle there, let's just bring that to life and what we've just said about that purposeful possession, playing forward early kind of football that Chelsea like to demonstrate.
Again, the transition, purposeful ball. And here, look, again, just a difference in finish. Further out, direct, earliest opportunity to finish. Where, if that was Arsenal, would it look different? Would Miedemar be looking for something different? Like variation of a player that can do all things, or are we looking for a player that's just really good at something? And I think it's that balance of what do we want to try and achieve.
Sure, and the triggers are there as well, because not many players will be able to play that ball before they've even taken a touch or controlled it. But Beth England's body language there to show where she wants the ball knows that she has that relationship with the player. Mm-hmm. So this is something that's been worked on. As soon as that ball bounces, if the back line's in a position to be exploited, that Beth England will be onto that. Yeah.
And it seems to be quite heavily predominant as well, Si, from watching the footage and from the data, that it's that real centre-back, full-back pass, that area that she tries to get into to really stretch the back line, to then create opportunities like that.
Sure, and we've got a similar one now with just that transition, the ball bobbing around. Sorry, not transition, just coming from a deeper area.
Yeah. Again, though, it's a similar position, start position, but the run looks different.
Yeah.
Again, so different type of finish.
This is something that would have been mastered in practice. Again, the technical ability of the midfielder is really, really high there. So she knows that she can make that run first time without delaying it too much.
Yeah, and it's on 2 occasions now, hasn't it? And both her arm signals have been there. Both she's been in a similar position off the back shoulder blind spot of the centre back there. Just sets off and knows what types of runs she needs based on where the ball is, and it presents 2 different types of finishing, 2 different ways of doing things, but a real similar pattern in the way that the opportunity has been presented.
Exactly. So we've taken the data, we've gained some information from it, which is, I guess, this kind of thing when we start to look at the locations, and then the insight then comes from reviewing performance again and planning sessions of that nature. So that takes us on then to the considerations that coaches can have for these individuals within the sessions to really get out working on things that are commonly happening within the games, or trying to increase the frequency of things that maybe aren't happening quite as much. So it goes down to individual development plans or learning guides, and it's about either developing areas that maybe you want to see a little bit more of, or you want to see higher success rates, or concentrating on areas that you're seeing a lot of. So you can take that from the data if you were to collect certain things like that yourself within your own environment. So Kelsey, how would you plan then? You've got some data, you've gained some information from it. So what considerations then go into that individual within the session?
I think then it's starting to really break down, as we did for Miedemar and Beth there, just some real key things that will go into the melting pot of that finish itself. And I think quite often we speak about the technical detail. So the technical action, the striking of the ball, how many times do we see strike the ball, head over the ball, keep the ball down, those types of things that we hear. But what about all the things that accomplish that and come with it, that allow that to happen and be either successful or unsuccessful? And I think those, we alluded to it on both strikers there, and both videos, that positioning skills, the body orientation, and their position out of possession. When we don't have the ball, where am I? What am I looking for? What am I sensing, seeing, smelling around what could happen next? Then when we do transition, we do get the ball, what am I expecting based on the relationships with the players in my team, but also then predetermined pictures. Those scanning and perception skills in the moment, what am I seeing in the moment versus that real game craft of the player, of knowing what my own strengths and weaknesses are and what I would like to do that's pre-planned. What have I seen of the centre half? What have I seen of the goalkeeper? What do I know of the goalkeeper? Do they go down early? Do they like to rush out and be quite aggressive? Does the centre half like to put pressure on really early that can spin and get in behind? Are they right cautious where they'll probably drop off, which gives me more room to get on it and turn and faced up? So all those things that I'm pre-planned and I know about the team and I know about the opposition versus that real stuff that I'm seeing in the moment. What can I put into practice that I've pre-planned? What is changing and ever evolving in the moment based on my perception of what I'm seeing and scanning and taking pictures of? And I think, how often do we really delve into these things? What are the players thinking? They're on the ball. What are you thinking now? What are you thinking now? What are you seeing? Where's the space? Where you want to exploit? Why are you thinking that? Based on, the information you already know and the processing versus what you're seeing right now. And the timing of, obviously, that changes based on that perception of what you're seeing. Is it the timing? Are they arriving at the right time? Is it the timing of the changing of the orientation of the body? Is it the timing of the scanning and what they're doing? Is it the timing of the movement, the foot patterning that's not quite allowing that shot to be successful? is it the deception and disguise that we're quite predictable in what we do? Do we need more deception and disguise? You can see there, Beth, that video of Beth there, that secondary touch that just takes it around the keeper to be able to finish. Does she know, is that pre-planned that she knows the keeper's going to be aggressive, comes out, goes down early, and might need that additional touch to then play in? Or has she then worked that out and had the perception in the moment to do that? And, you know, looking at their movement skills, what are the different factors that determine that? You know, are they things that you've got your external context or scoreline, things that have happened prior, things you know prior, weather conditions, etc. Situational, the sequence, patterns. You've got opponent specific, so you know strengths and weaknesses of them, going back to that craft or perception in the moment. So are we starting to think about all these things when we're looking at finishing the attack, when we're looking at finishing practices, technical practices? Where's their attention? Where's the player's attention? What's their attentional focus? What they're looking for? What they're scanning and noticing? What's the timing of when they do that? Do they know how to really manipulate their own strengths and weaknesses to get the best out of outwitting that opponent, whether it's the goalkeeper, whether it's the centre half? How do I get onto my preferred foot, my preferred area, my preferred type of finish? What am I thinking constantly? What's my intentions? And then what's that technical detail? My hip placement, my head placement, my shoulder placement, knee placement, ankle positioning, strength of ankle. Is it really strong or is it really loose to allow to take the weight of the pass and the weight of the cross? Where's my weight distribution, front foot, back foot? What's my speed of the leg in which I'm then starting to follow through with in order to then start thinking of the type of finish? What's my foot positioning like? All these different things that, you know, that I talk about it quite regular in terms of that symptom versus cause. You know, what is the real cause of what's going on in all of these things? Is it a multitude of these things? Is it one of the two of these things in particular that's actually not the technical detail, it's not the technical action, it's something else? Or is it actually the timing's correct, we get into the right places, we know, but it's just that deception or disguise or the actual technical itself? So I think once we've brought down all the data and we started to interpret how to use that to get the best out of our players, and an individual player in particular, such as Beth, then how do we really unpick that to think, what's all the things that encompass that? So all the stuff that's on this slide now, really start to use that quadrant tool that's used and spoke about a lot to really unpick then, what is it we go after with this player? How do we support her to be more effective and more efficient? What's next? What are the opposition now presenting to her and stopping her from doing? Because the opposition are going to start doing that. So it's starting to think about how, you know, drilling into each of these areas and start thinking in some detail about what this means for me, my team, my players, and how we best support them move forward and continue to develop.
Great, some outstanding detail there. So that takes us to the conclusion of the webinar. Really, hopefully we've hit the key outcomes. We've presented some data, developed it into some information for you, and it's now for you to go away into your own environment and try and bring out the insight, really, because without insight, the data becomes meaningless if you haven't interpreted it in the right way for your own outcomes within practices and games. This is the first of a two-part series of webinars. The second part will be using a player to provide player insights for what some of this data might mean for practice design. So we'll see you again on that. But for now, thanks very much for listening in and watching. Kelsey, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thanks, Si.
Cheers. So thank you very much, and see you again soon.
Thank you.